The meeting of the Accountability and Administrative Review Committee is now in session. Obviously, we don't have a whole lot of other members. We are told that we might have a couple walking in at any moment, but I don't want to wait any longer to get started. Today's hearing is on state information technology projects. The initial impetus for doing this hearing today was an article from Information Week magazine, which I think was distributed or is available for everyone, posted by Bob Evans. This is from January 29th of 2009, saying California state IT is a monumental disaster. And you can read it yourselves. Then there's a couple of other articles. This came to my attention in the summer, late spring, summer, and it's something that we've been monitoring. IT projects have come up in this committee in at least two instances that I can think of off the top of my head. One was the Administrative Office of the Courts. The other is the Victims' Compensation Fund, both of which had IT projects, major IT projects that are problematic, at least at some level. So the improvement in this area is something that obviously we need to see for the state because of the costs. You're talking about over $7 billion in IT projects that are underway currently in the state of California. So we need to make sure that money is being spent as wisely as possible. We also need the performance from these IT systems. We need to be able to deliver service better, faster, and we need to be able to identify as a legislature what information we need in order to make these decisions, whether that's to ratchet down a project, to let it continue to develop and to its conclusion, or what are the decision points to end a project that may not be performing anywhere near where it needs to be on time or on budget. So we need to be able to figure out what questions the legislature needs to be able to ask, and what answers we need in order to be able to make these decisions. We want to demystify the IT process to some extent in very straightforward terms. We want members to have the information. Again, that's the goal here, is to make sure that members, not just today, but over the course of the budget process, have the information that we need in order to make the decisions that have to be made. Again, this morning we're hearing that the budget deficit is $21 billion over the next 18 months. That colors everything we do. And so to the extent that IT is a significant dollar contributor, not necessarily just on general fund, because a lot of these projects are federally funded or special funded. I acknowledge that, but that's no excuse to waste money. And so I think it's important for us to have a framework for the legislature to be able to engage in this process. It's something we clearly don't have. I will acknowledge that the CIO has, over the last 3 years, really made some progress in these areas. But again, we're part of the decision making process here, and we need to have information in order to make our decisions and give direction. We're not here today to indict any given project. There's no target for today's hearing. It is an overarching discussion about IT projects, comparing them to each other. And we want to get the information, again, to be able to have accountability. 3 members of this committee sit on Budget Sub 4. There's a whole lot of overlap between the two committees in terms of what we do here and how we follow through. in Budget Sub 4. So my goal is to be able to have the tools available by February, March, so that we can, in the budget process, be better informed to make decisions that the legislature as a whole can follow through on in our budget for next year. So with that, I'd like to invite up our panel from the Legislative Analyst's Office, Erica Lee; from the Department of Finance, Richard Gillihan; from Office of Chief Information Officer, Adrian Farley and John Dickinson; and from the Franchise Tax Board, Susan Cadieux. As usual, we'll start with the LAO.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I'm Erica Lee with the Legislative Analyst's Office, and I've been asked to provide a high-level overview of the changes that the OCIO, the Office of the State Chief Information Officer, has brought to the state and the potential associated savings and cost avoidance based on those changes. And just to begin with, I want to just say that the OCIO was established in statute in 2007 and formally began operations in January 2008. Statute spells out particular goals and responsibilities, including for the OCIO, including the establishing and enforcing of statewide IT strategic plans, policies, and standards, minimizing overlap and redundancy and reducing costs for state operations, and approving, suspending, and possibly terminating IT projects, among many other goals. Now, since its establishment, the OCIO has attempted and accomplished many of these duties, and I'm just going to start off with a list of that and kind of work towards the reorganization and go from there. It first issued its statewide strategic plan in January of 2009, so earlier this year, and in that plan, it spells out the strategies, mission, and goals for California's IT business. After that, it also has implemented statewide policies to standardize IT practices, and a couple of these come to mind. The first one is the establishment of the California Project Management Methodology, and this is a methodology for all state IT project managers to follow. It's actually a requirement that these managers are trained and utilize this methodology, and this methodology was created specifically for the needs, the particular needs of the state of California's IT projects, which tend to be very large and costly and risky. This ensures that the project managers are receiving the adequate training that they need to provide leadership for these projects. And secondly, as part of that training methodology, there are regular status reports that are due, and these are also requirements that the OCIO asks for all projects. So depending upon their criticality, whether it's sort of high criticality, medium, or low, different projects have to fill out these standardized forms, which are kind of like progress reports for projects. So project managers have to basically be transparent with how their projects are doing. These status reports are available online, so anybody can access. And I have to say that many people in our office have utilized these status reports as sort of useful information at a glance, and have follow-up questions based on that, and actually go to the actual project staff to talk with them about these. Those are a couple of examples of the statewide policy implementations that have been implemented since the OCIO. And thirdly, I want to just talk about how the OCIO has identified points where they may leverage state staff rather than using outside contractors. And specifically, I'm thinking about the Independent Project Oversight Consultants, sometimes called IPOCs. The OCIO is currently attempting to train and transition its own staff to provide the service to projects. Generally, this is a service that in the past has been contracted out And I don't have the numbers, but I believe that millions of dollars have been spent annually on contracting out to these vendors to provide this service, which is it's an oversight service for projects. The potential of savings and cost avoidance here, I think, can be pretty substantial. So transitioning from the vendors to state staff. And before I go on, are there any questions?
On that point, the cost avoidance is net of the costs for the staff.
Right. So
Okay.
if you were to compare how much a project was spent on a contract for these services compared to the one or maybe two individuals that would be doing the same work, there's quite a difference. I don't know. Maybe the OCIO can speak to that later, but there is something measurable there. Cost.
Yeah, I just would like to see where that number came from.
Okay.
Thank you.
And those are some of the changes the OCIO has attempted from its inception, January 08, to I'm bringing us now to the reorganization. So in May 2009, this past May, the legislature approved the reorganization of several IT functions and offices over to the OCIO. So basically increasing its responsibilities and duties. And since then, further changes have ensued, and I'll just list a few of them. So recently, the newly consolidated Office of Information Security released its statewide strategic plan, so similar to the strategic plan I spoke of earlier. This is concerning security. And so it lists the priorities, statewide priorities for maintaining the integrity of the state's data and data systems, among many other things. Also, newly consolidated is the data center. So we have now the data center sort of answering to the OCIO. And this has allowed the OCIO to begin to establish a common technology platform that all departments and all agencies across the state kind of have to comply. They have to follow these rules for their IT purchases and for future investments in IT systems. Again, looking kind of at a more strategic, global, statewide look at how state agencies and departments are purchasing IT goods and services. And I also want to talk about some of the changes that have been happening with IT procurement. Specifically, I'm thinking about the OCIO's work with DGS Procurement Division. They recently have followed an initiative to implement a shortened time frame for the procurement, for the overall procurements for IT systems. And this is in response to very lengthy procurements that have occurred, as you may well know. And additionally, I'd like to say that the OCIO has begun to encourage other IT projects to look into an alternative procurement approach, sometimes referred to as a multi-stage procurement. And this is something that actually our office, the LAO, sees as a possible way of really minimizing some of the risks that are involved with purchasing large state IT systems. And we recently had a publication on that. It's available online if you'd like to, more detail on that. And just in terms of the total, we believe that the state should expect to see some savings and cost avoidance. I don't know what the total is. I know that there are numbers out there issued by the OCIO. We haven't done an analysis on that, but just looking at some of the things that are being done to consolidate and standardize, we do expect to see some savings there, potential savings. An obvious one is building the state workforce. So we're training our own state staff to carry out duties that will help. This will help build a valuable long-term workforce for the state, so people can kind of move from project to project as opposed to us contracting out for these services. We're actually building this set of skills within the state workforce. This also reduces our dependence on contractors, and so thus we should see some cost avoidance, as I mentioned earlier. And the changes to standardize, the changes that have led to standardization in training and project approach also should lend towards cost, avoidance and some savings. It ensures that project priorities and actions are aligned with statewide priorities, so no longer are our systems being developed because they're good for the department or they're good for the agency, but they're not good for the overall state. And just having that kind of perspective, knowing what's happening across the state should should reduce some of the redundancy in terms of systems and money spent that has happened in the past. And also we're ensuring that pivotal staff are receiving the training that they need so that there's greater accountability. There's more oversight in what's going on and how people are being staffed and trained. And finally, changes resulting in greater statewide strategic planning, I touched upon this before, ensures that the state investment is actually a statewide investment and not something that's particular to a department or an agency. It reduces some of the redundancy and overlap that we've seen in the past. And as a whole, the state is really making long-term investments for the good of the state. And I'll leave further details in terms of costs and dollar amounts to the OCAO. But before ending, I would like to say that there's a potential trade-off to these savings, and we mentioned this in our letter to the Little Hoover Commission last March, I believe, in response to the reorganization. And it's just that there will be, with greater standardization, there has to be less flexibility. So state departments and agencies will not be able to go out and kind of buy the things that they think are best for themselves. They really have to abide by the standards of the state, and it is more limited. I don't know how limited it is compared to what it was, but in the past, departments and agencies could pretty much purchase the technology that they wanted, that they thought was best for them, and now that no longer exists. So just the acknowledgement that there is less flexibility, and that there could potentially be some pushback from departments and agencies as the OCAO goes forward with further consolidation and standardization. Thank you. Do you have any questions, or are we saving?
Assemblymember Arambula.
I'm still shaking off the road dust, having driven in from Fresno, so bear with me. But this state is known for computers and being a leader in information technology, and yet the state has not kept pace, at least in any organized fashion. What kind of training is required to be good at coordinating computer systems? Where do people come from? And shouldn't we have in-house that kind of capacity, that kind of horsepower to put together and to organize and coordinate? It seems like we're always contracting out of necessity, perhaps, because we don't have that in-house expertise. But shouldn't we? We're making a big enough investment over the years, and things are constantly changing, so it seems like there is a need to have some in-house expertise that can help guide all of these, the whole list of projects and others that will undoubtedly come up. What do you see the state needing to do to have the personnel, the intellectual capacity, the knowledge, the judgment as to how to set up these systems and coordinate them across departments? What should we be insisting that the administration look at and do so that we don't have everybody in their own silos doing their own thing?
Well, to acknowledge one point, and I think you make an important one, that the state is losing part of the workforce that they currently have due to age, retirement, and I know as I talk with project leaders, there's always, they lament the fact that they're losing people with IT skills. I mean, they've been working for the state 20, 30 years, and so there's an acknowledgement that there is a gap. But I also believe that that some of what the OCAO is doing is attempting to meet that by training more staff for project management and more staff for IT. Will probably be able to speak more specifically, but in terms of that gap, I believe that there is that gap that needs to be addressed. There is, I think, an acknowledgement that we don't want to be contracting out when we can build a workforce, a state workforce, for some of the technical matters. To the extent that the administration is doing that, I think, again, the OCAO could speak more readily to that. But I believe in terms of project management, I see that happening. There's sort of movement on that ground.
And you know, I was with the county when we went through the Y2K issue, and we wound up having to contract out for an awful lot of services because we didn't have them in-house. It was a one-time event. But after Y2K was over, we managed to keep on some of those consultants and turn them into in-house staff, or to minimize. And I know that there are times when legitimately you have to contract out. You can't have every particular expertise in-house. But the coordination seems to be a unique state responsibility. I mean, it's hard to coordinate out planning and coordination for the state. That's supposed to be the administration's responsibility. And these projects cover a number of different administrations, Republican and Democrat, so it seems like it's a systemic problem. And so, perhaps if later speakers can also address this. But it just seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that, that we have a variety of problems from a number of departments. The last meeting we heard about the judicial system, and periodically in the news we'll read about yet one other example of a project that seems to be taking longer or going into directions that had not been anticipated, or not working properly with some other sister department. So I'm just curious what we can do to make sure that we don't go through a repetition of these kinds of instances. And any insights into what we should do would be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll now go over to the OCIO. Either one of you can start.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Assemblymember Arambula. My name is Adrian Farley, and I'm the Chief Deputy in the Office of the State CIO. I'm pleased to be here to discuss briefly the evolution of how IT is governed in the state, the role of the state CIO, as well as some of the efforts that we've taken over the past 18 months to really transform and modernize IT governance and operations within the state. As the committee is well aware, the application of information technology permeates almost every aspect of California's state government. The use of technology within state government is multifaceted, supporting a multitude of both policy and programmatic missions, and evolving in response to changing policy and programmatic goals. Since the early 1980s, the state has tried several models for governing the way it manages and operates information technology. Nearly all of these models to date were shown to be insufficient for the management and oversight of complex information technology infrastructures, as well as large IT projects. Accordingly, in 2006, the legislature and the governor enacted SB 834, which established the Office of the State CIO. The Budget Act of 2007 and accompanying legislation, SB 90, established the state CIO as a member of the governor's cabinet and provided both positions and funding for the office and its operations. The government code provides the state CIO with responsibility and authority for statewide technology vision, strategic planning and coordination, technology policy and standards, otherwise known as enterprise architecture, data management policy and standards, and the review and oversight of technology projects. I think it's also important to understand briefly what the state's IT environment looks like. There's approximately $3 billion annually in operating expense. That includes both more than 10,000 authorized positions, accounting for approximately $1.5 billion in salaries, wages, benefits, and overhead, and more than 130 individuals who are basically acting as technology leaders of sorts within departments and agencies across the state. Among the 100 approximate large IT projects under oversight by the state CIO, they exceed almost $7 billion in spending over 11 years. And in addition, there are approximately 500 small to medium IT projects that are underway by departments. To Assemblymember Arambula's point and question vis-a-vis human capital and the ability for the state to grow and transform in terms of bringing on and taking on more responsibility. More than 50% of the state's IT workforce will be eligible to retire within the next 5 years. And combine that with deferred spending on workforce development, there are obviously skill gaps and shortages in key areas, and this has in some cases led to an over-reliance on contractors. In terms of infrastructure, IT infrastructure, that includes things like data centers, servers, storage, and networks. The state has approximately 400,000 square feet of floor space and 405 locations for data centers, and we operate approximately 10,000 servers, about a third of which are more than 3 years old. In addition, the state has 2 petabytes of storage, which is the equivalent of 2 million gigabytes of storage. And we have more than 200,000 desktops and laptops in use in the executive branch. In terms of the context, earlier this year, as the LAO mentioned, the governor and the legislature allowed a reorganization plan to move forward, which integrated the Office of the State CIO, the Office of Information Security, as well as the Telecommunications Division within the Department of General Services, which had authority for 911 planning and public safety radio, as well as the state's general purpose data center. It provided the state CIO with authority for IT procurement policy, as well as enterprise IT management, and it achieves the consolidation of multiple kinds of contracts. We estimate that between savings and cost avoidance, the state will realize approximately $1.5 billion, both within the general fund and special funds and other funds over the next 5 years. Within the last 18 months, the OCIO has taken positive aspects to establish and enforce state IT strategic plans, policy standards, and enterprise architecture. One of the key things that we've done in partnership with agencies, the Department of Finance, and in consultation with the legislature and the LAO is the development of the IT capital planning process. This process specifically focuses on what the state's emerging needs for IT are and allows us to ensure prioritization and alignment with the state's policy and programmatic standards. To date, this has achieved more than $400 million in cost savings and avoidance, and it's allowed us to have a really clear picture as we go about planning. In terms of what we're doing to improve organizational maturity and the capacity for effective IT management, we've, as the LAO mentioned, established project and risk management methodologies and training, and we're developing a statewide workforce development planning strategy focused on recruiting and retaining IT staff, as well as enhancing training. As part of this process, we've really focused on establishing performance management and ensuring the efficiency and effectiveness of IT services. California clearly faces the same challenges as the rest of states in these uncertain economic times, but we believe that by continuing to make wise investments in technology, we can ensure the continued improvement in services as well as the efficiency and effectiveness of government programs. Thank you.
Are you going to present as well? I am interested in a couple of items from our analysis here. The difference, there were 202 IT projects that were proposed in your first review of IT projects for the next 5 years. And of those, 111 are the current projects under development, but 91 were denied. Can you give me there's nothing in particular, just what were the criteria for denying some of these projects? Because it seems like a significant number.
Sure. We use a process that is known both in it's known as portfolio management within the context of IT, and it's similar. It's a process that's borrowed from management consulting as well as the investment management. And effectively, it is a prioritization of the use of scarce resource. What provides the greatest cost benefit? What's the greatest cost benefit? What has the greatest alignment with statewide policy and programmatic goals? What has the greatest alignment with statewide IT policy? How do we what projects have the greatest opportunity for reuse across multiple departments? For example, within the labor agency, they were able to work with us to ensure a single case management solution that met all of the business needs of different departments within the agency, but each of the different departments didn't need to go and find their own independent solution. And by leveraging technology like that, you develop a skill base within state government that can be reused among different departments. It's the diffusion and the multiplicity of technologies that really makes building a deep skill base difficult.
But in terms of deciding which ones were rejected, were they allowed an appeal of a decision, and then you was it an iterative process? Or
Absolutely.
How does that work?
We provided the framework for how the process would begin in the summer of 2008, and throughout the summer and fall, we had iterative discussions with agency and department IT leaders, business leaders, and came to this list of approved projects that most effectively aligned with the statewide policy objectives. Departments have the ability in subsequent years to bring forward projects again for consideration. There's a due diligence effort that departments have to do before the state should agree to invest resources in a project. And in some cases, that due diligence hadn't been completed prior to the submittal of specific policy or project proposals.
In January, you're going to be releasing your IT strategic plan.
Yes, it will be essentially an update to the strategic plan that we issued in January 15th of this year.
Okay. And is there, you're a year further along in the process. Are there any major changes from last year to this year?
In terms of, thank you, Linda. In terms of the major changes in terms of strategy, we believe that the strategy that we laid out in the January 2009 strategic plan remains something that we can build upon. It was built through a collaborative and iterative process that engaged state business and IT leaders. And are there going to be tactical changes? Of course, because as you move forward, you have to be flexible and agile enough to course correct, and that's what we're going to do. But in terms of the broad strategic goals laid out in the plan, we believe they're on target, and we'll continue to work toward implementing them.
We have a copy in our packets of the OCIO project watch list. And on here, you have 45 projects that are listed. The budget column on the far right, I really appreciated that that you flagged those that were within cost or those that were higher cost or lower cost.
Right.
But there's nothing similar for the schedule.
There's
the
a
schedule.
column
It just
right
says
next-
behind schedule. So is there a way to? I mean, because
We provide-
behind schedule could be a couple of months or it could be years, and so it would be helpful if we're going to be looking at these things at a glance like this to be able to see where, so, behind schedule is just it's some nominal amount of time, but a significant delay should be flagged in some way, I think, for our purposes.
This means if it's marked behind schedule in this column, these are those projects where the project has been required through existing state policy to submit what's known as a special project report, which means that the project from its initial approval to today is more than 10% behind schedule. And so that's what these projects represent. This document was provided in response to a request from the committee, and we can provide greater detail as to what the temporal framework is for this. But, for example, a 12-month project, if it falls behind, 40
months.
days, is beyond 10% and would require a special project report. However, some of these projects, if a project is 5 years and falls behind 90 days, the impact is not the same.
Yeah, I think some further gradation there, just so that we know, what are the real problematic ones.
Right. We have status reports for every single state IT project that's approved through the OCIO that provides, exhaustive documentation. I think to get back to the point that the LAO made, really we've brought an unprecedented level of transparency to the state's IT project process. We've provided more information on state IT projects than any other state in the nation, more information than the federal government, and more information than the state's ever provided to date. So in terms of providing detail and information about where we are and where we're going, there's extensive information available.
And I do want to acknowledge there's another chart in here with projects that are within cost and schedule, and it's 2 pages, single spaced. So I mean, it isn't all the stuff, the bad stuff, but obviously we want to focus more on fixing the stuff that's not working as opposed to the stuff that's working and going along. This, and maybe the LAO, I don't know if you have an opinion on this as well, but the Bureau of State Audits was concerned about the review process, the independent project oversight, and they said that there might be a conflict there in terms of OCIO doing the project oversight and then doing the independent review of that project. How do you respond to those concerns that were expressed by the auditor?
Well, I think really there's to draw a comparison. Historically, when the state has done project oversight, it is, for the most complex projects, gone out and hired consultants that frankly cost hundreds of dollars an hour to watch projects throughout the entire life cycle. That's a very expensive thing to do. And at various phases of a project, especially during the planning phases prior to actually having a system integrator come on board, the value of having a consultant watching that planning process is of limited value, especially when their expertise, the independent project oversight consultants, their expertise is in project management. And the state needs to take ownership over projects. One of the problems throughout the course of, the history of California's IT governance is that we've attenuated accountability by hiring consultants to watch consultants and then tell us what those consultants that we've hired are doing. To provide clearer lines of accountability, responsibility, and authority, we believe that it makes sense to have state employees who understand what the state's IT project process is, who understand California's project management methodology, be the ones that, at least in the planning phase, are doing the project oversight work. That isn't to say, however, that there isn't a role for contractors to provide expertise in particular areas, especially around technical review, doing the planning for system testing. There are definitely opportunities there, but when it comes to project management, the state needs to own that process, both from the actually day-to-day management of projects as well as the oversight of that management.
What kind of firewalls do you have between, the state employees? How do you separate them so that this perception of a conflict that the auditor raised is handled?
Well, there are two separate organizations within the OCIO that have oversight responsibilities. As we discussed before, there's the portfolio kind of oversight, which does the review and approval of projects. That's one line. And the other line of accountability and authority is around the project oversight functionality. And that is a separate management chain. And so by having separate management chains that are ultimately accountable to the state CIO, there isn't a concern about one area influencing the other.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me express deep empathy with your job. It is almost inconceivably difficult to do properly. By analogy, it's sort of like you're trying to tune up the engine, but the car is still moving down the highway, and and there's moving pieces all around you. In terms of, I understand the need to develop a priority list, and we have to make some decisions based on cost-benefit analysis, and some projects maybe are deemed so essential, or the benefits are so great, or the costs are so great of not doing something, that they're high up on the list and they're going to get funded. At some point, do you, just so that we can understand the way that you are involved with Department of Finance and budgeting issues, where do you get your parameters as to what resources you or the state have to work with? And what happens, like when we wake up this morning and see, the ledge analyst said $21 billion out of whack over the next 18 months. That undoubtedly, may likely result in the figure that you have to work with shrinking. And so what do you do to revisit that priority list and determine, okay, given a change in the resources we have to work with, which ones get the green light and which ones, are held temporarily?
Sure. We have a very strong partnership with the Department of Finance, and many of my staff currently at the OCIO came to my office from the Department of Finance. We begin the process each year with the review of project proposals. That process begins in the summer and continues on throughout the fall with the consideration of budget change proposals that are needed in order to fund projects. We work both with departments and the Department of Finance throughout the fall to analyze the availability of resources and the relative benefit of various IT projects. We begin by looking at those projects that will either generate revenue or avoid some kind of significant penalty to the state. Obviously, those are the projects that rise to the top of the list.
Like the child support services a couple of years ago.
That would be a good example. Another example is the project that's also being run through the Franchise Tax Board called Enterprise Data to Revenue, which will produce significant revenues for the state and help close the approximately $6 billion tax gap that exists.
That's through the Board of Equalization? Or
It's through the Franchise Tax Board.
Okay.
There are other projects, for example, within both the Board of Equalization as well as the Employment Development Department that have serious opportunity to generate revenue. In addition, there are some issues where system failure would be so disastrous from either a cost perspective or from a service delivery perspective that the investment by the state must happen. And that's really the framework in these difficult fiscal times, and public safety obviously is a consideration. But we're not doing things in these fiscal times that are nice to have. We're only doing those things that are essential.
And even within the essential, we may get to the point where we have to prioritize those.
Absolutely.
Here we are in November. We will get that. We, the legislature, will get a proposed budget sometime in January, if there's no call for emergency session between now and then. How are you working to revise your project lists based on these changing numbers?
Well, there are iterative discussions that occur within the administration throughout the fall that look at projections, fund conditions. I mean, there are various. If you look at the total expenditure of IT dollars in the state, approximately 40% are general fund and 60% are special funded federal funds or other funds. So we look at what opportunities exist to shift the funding source from the general fund to other funds. Maybe now we pay for a project with special funds, and in the future, when the fiscal condition changes, the project costs are shifted back to the general fund. So we take a broad and long view of how investments are made, and it's a very collaborative process that occurs within the administration, primarily between the OCIO and the Department of Finance with the governor's office.
Okay. During budget hearings, I gather if you're asked for the rationale for why some projects are being recommended and others are not, you would be able to provide that criteria that forms your analysis.
Absolutely. Our office conducts a deep analysis of every project proposal, both from the business case review as well as from the budget proposal perspective. Okay. And we provide those to the committee and work very closely with the legislative analysts on that process also.
Okay. Now, you inherited a very difficult situation, and it seems like you've been very busy in a short period of time. Looking forward, what can we expect a year from now? What should we be looking to see be accomplished? What kind of changes, or what would the landscape look like a year from now?
Well, in the next year, we're really looking at two major areas of initiatives. One is furthering the state's IT infrastructure consolidation so that we have a consistent and secure base for IT operations. This plays into the long-term development of state human capital management, and that we build a deep understanding of a limited set of technologies that are still in line with best practice and with a process that allows emerging technologies to come in. At the same time, we're going to begin developing a more robust and accessible kind of transparency effort about both projects as well as broader IT expenditures.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you that you put yourself in our shoes. Well, what questions should we be asking you in terms of the progress you're making, or the speed with which you're trying to integrate all of these different strands?
Well, one of the elements of the reorganization plan that went into effect in April of May of last year, or this year, time flies, is that the OCIO do performance reporting around several key metrics. And some of those key metrics are, what is the state doing to rationalize the number of servers that the state has? We have approximately 10,000 now. Our goal in 5 years is to, through the use of virtualization and other kinds of technologies, to reduce that by half. One of the other areas is to reduce that reduces both cost as well as energy requirements. So it's a significant effort, both from a green as well as fiscally. Another area is to improve the number of projects that are completed on time and on budget. Our goal is to hit an 80% threshold. That's the goal that we've laid out, which is, our goal is 100%, of course, but our target is to hit 80%. Right now we're at 58% on time and on budget. So we're continuing to make positive steps towards, and we'd be happy to provide you with the list of all of the metrics that we're tracking, and we'll be publishing that as part of our strategic plan in January.
As one member, Mr. Chair, I would find that useful. And
we'd be happy to provide it to you.
Okay. One final question, or line of questions. What can we do to be helpful to you? Now, you mentioned staff, or we had a bit of a discussion on staffing and other resources. But having warm bodies isn't necessarily the solution. Having people who know outdated technologies isn't the solution. What do you need, and where are we in terms of making sure that you have what it is that you need, both in terms of personnel and other resources, for you to be successful?
Well, I think we have a strong basis to move forward. One of the things that we've done is to open up the testing process so that we can bring in skilled resources and from different levels of government. One thing that, over time, as the fiscal picture improves throughout the state in the next 3 to 5 years,
we can only hope.
I mean, fingers crossed, is to look at the issue among parity in terms of public sector pay to IT employees. I mean, that's really a differentiating factor, because LA County, even different branches of state government, have varying degrees of compensation.
You want to make sure we're competitive in terms of the right kind of people.
Absolutely. That's a key thing that we need to look at. I mean, my office, for example, is in the same building as the Army Corps of Engineers. And if you look, for example, this is a non-IT example, but between the pay that's given to engineers within the Army Corps versus those at Department of Water Resources, you can see why somebody may choose to work for the Army Corps of Engineers.
So we turn out to be the training agency for somebody else.
Right, and that means that we have a lot of sunk cost in terms of getting people up to speed in several areas. But if we can retain them through flexible work schedules. Those are things that we can do in the short term while we don't have the ability to provide the compensation competitiveness. But the flexibility, engaging workplace, those things are what we're focusing on in the near term. But over the long term, compensation is critical.
And where does someone get the necessary training or background to go into IT project management or coordination? Are there majors? Is it people coming out of business schools, or where do folks come from? What's the pool of applicants, or are we working with academia to prepare training programs that would meet our needs?
My experience is that project managers are born almost, and the way they get the skill necessary to be project managers is by doing projects. I mean, I've worked with people who have PhDs in philosophy and people who have advanced degrees in math, and both can be effective project managers because it's the way they view the world. It's the way they view it's really a way of a worldview in terms of project management. People that are good project managers are passionate about delivery. That is always on their mind, and they want to meet the goals and desires of their client and the customer and do it within the framework that you as policymakers have decided. And I think the best way is to bring young people in, get them on projects, get them committed to what it's all about, and be able to keep them after they have the experience and skill doing projects, keep them in government.
And assuming we're successful, that would require some ramp up over a period of time. In the meantime, I assume we will have a continuing need to seek out consulting from the outside on a case-by-case basis.
We're doing that, but the state also, given the current fiscal economic environment, we have been able to bring on people who have been let go as major corporations have downsized. So that's one area that we're bringing people from the outside into government who have significant project management expertise. For example, we've hired people who have previously been consultants to the state who realize that over the long term, being a state employee is better for them.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me that latitude.
Absolutely. We have a little latitude today. I wanted to ask a couple of questions that are specific to the projects that were rejected. I just flagged these because of their size, and you don't have to provide it today. But what I'd like is some explanation or rationale for why these projects were denied, because I think it'll help us to see what the threshold is by seeing what it is that killed a project before it was approved. It will help us to see what the criteria are. So the first is the employment tax system at EDD.
Mr. Chair, I can explain why that project was rejected.
Okay, I didn't. I don't want to have you explain all of these if you don't have the information. If you do,
on this particular project, I do have the rationale, and it's actually a very positive case. There's a project that the legislature approved and the Employment Development Department is currently implementing called ACES, which is an advanced tax collection system. As part of that project, it's a project that is benefits funded. So the vendor doesn't get paid until they deliver benefit in terms of increased revenue to the state. Mm-hmm. One of the components of that system is actually this functionality that was proposed by EDD. So they no longer need to pursue this project because it's included within the ACES project.
But the price tag here is $155 million. So
that's correct.
as part of this other system, was the $155 million or some significant portion of that added on to that?
That project is entirely based on benefit. So it's zero cost to the state.
But I understand that, but it still costs something to do it.
Right, the risk premium, if you will. And so the project costs for that I will pull up for you.
Okay. And these are all $10 million and above. That's why I flagged these. DCR, Disability and Effective Communication Accommodation Tracking System. That was for $13 million.
We'll be happy to work with your staff on having a list that we can get back to everybody on.
DPH, Screening Information System, expanded newborn and prenatal screening. That's a $22 million item. DPH again, California Biomonitoring Information Technology System. I remember voting on that bill. $24 million. DHCS, the DHCS Enterprise Resource Planning System. That's $45 million. And DDS, Cost Recovery Billing System, that was $11 million. So if you could just give us some narrative of each one of those and what the decisions were for rejecting them.
We'd be happy to.
And also, I made the point in my opening comments, and you reiterated that about 40% of the cost for these things is general fund. For budgetary purposes, I think it would be helpful if we flagged those that had significant general fund components to them. Not necessarily 100%, but some significant general fund component, so that again, as we're making these decisions, we realize where the money's coming from. I think my personal view is on special funds, as long as it's being done right and in a cost-effective manner, I really don't care. If it's needed in some way, there's some filter that you determine that it's needed. I just want to make sure that those are being done on time and on budget. But the general fund ones, in light of our situation, I think we're going to be scrutinizing a whole lot closer than we have in the near past.
To get to
Yes.
back to the automated collection enhancement system at EDD, that project's approximately $95 million.
So it's a $60 million savings by doing it as part of this other thing, as opposed to a standalone.
Yeah, it would have been in a custom development. That was the way that EDD had planned the system, and the solution that they ended up purchasing is an integrated solution that includes the collection as well as the accounting piece.
That is very good to know. Makes you wonder about some of these other proposals, the smaller ones, if they couldn't be embedded in larger projects.
Several of the projects that were denied or deferred in the IT capital planning process were done so because we believed those departments could better leverage a specific technology solution that had already been deployed within another department in their agency or in another agency across government. Especially, for example, as it related to the Department of Public Health, they were asking to invest money in a new enterprise resource planning solution, and we
Those are the ones
believe
I flagged.
that they can wait in order for the fiscal system to come on rather than implementing their own ERP system now.
All right. One last set of questions, I guess, on the projects that are under development over $100 million. And I don't know if that was something that you did just for us or whether you have it they're the 14 projects that have been highlighted. I was looking at the time frames for each of these, and 8 of the 14 are due to be completed this year or next year. And so to me, that is something that we need to be watching to make sure that we're going to hit these targets.
These are the projects that keep me up at night.
Yeah, this is the California Child Support Automated System, Child Support Enforcement. That's due in 2009. Was that delivered already?
Yes.
Okay. The California Child Support Automation System State Disbursement Unit, was that done?
Yes.
Okay, so those are the 2 for 2009. The ones for 10 are IHSS Case Management, ISOS.
Yes, that's the transition from the interim system and over to what's a system known as C4.
Okay, and Consolidated Information Technology Infrastructure Program at Corrections, Human Resources Management System, 21st Century Project at Controller's Office, Business Information System at Corrections. So the 2 for 2009 were completed, so we're down to 6 out of the 14 for 2010 that we have to hit targets on.
As the committee is aware, or may be aware, I know for sure Assemblymember Arambula is aware, the Human Resource Management System project, the 21st Century Project at the State Controller's Office, it has been challenged, partially because the vendor that was selected to implement that project was essentially fired by the state and subsequently went into bankruptcy. And so the state is now in the process of re-procuring system integration services and will go through the budget process, which the Section 11 process, in order to continue that project. And there will be a budget request as part of in January.
They were fired this year?
Yes.
So 5 years in to the project.
They were not quite 5 years. This they hadn't been on board for 5 years. This includes the time from planning to actual.
For some significant portion of time, they
yes.
And so I take it we're not going to hit that 2010 target.
No.
Yeah. All right. I think, again, for budgetary purposes, to be able to flag those that are due next year and where we are on every one of them collectively.
Yeah, I believe we provided your staff with a breakdown of every project in the portfolio.
She provided us kind of the abridged version.
Okay.
For obvious reasons, because there's so many of these. Okay, with that, I'd like to ask Finance to present.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Assemblymember Arambula. Richard Gillihan with the Department of Finance. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and discuss the role of Finance's IT Consulting Unit, or ITCU. Approximately 2 years ago, following the enactment of SB 90, the majority of our department's former Office of Technology Review, Oversight, and Security staff transferred to the newly established OCIO. However, pursuant to the legislation, some responsibilities remained within Finance in the form of the ITCU. While small in size, about 5 PYs, the ITCU performs a wide range of activities all related to the state's IT program. Some of those functions include general IT consulting and analysis to the Finance budget units, liaison and coordination between Finance and the OCIO. To that end, we've developed an MOU with OCIO which defines roles, responsibilities, process, including document exchange, both project-related documents and budget proposals, communication and decision-making, timeframes, representation at hearings and pre-hearings, responding to legislative information requests, IT-related reports, that sort of thing. We also have a function relative to the State Data Center, or OTEC, is required in Government Code 11540, which is to perform analysis of rates and services and prepare reports for the Technology Services Board. That's done in coordination with the budget unit that has the budget for the data center. We also serve as staff to the vice chair of the TSB. We perform operational analysis of proposed OCIO IT policies, asking questions like, is it workable, what is the cost, and how can it be funded? We often work in collaboration with them in the development of policy. Some of the policies have been discussed today, but examples include the project management methodology, the IT capital planning process, establishment of the statewide enterprise architecture program, computer room construction policy, and one under current development is power management software that we work closely with them on. We're also responsible for Control Section 11 and 1110 legislative notifications, and in that role we work with the LAO and the JLBC on notices. We've submitted 15 notices since January of 2008 and have a couple currently under review. And we also perform fiscal oversight of specified IT projects, some of which include the 21st Century Project, Fiscal, some of the large HHS projects, that sort of thing. That's sort of a snapshot of what the IT consulting unit does. I know there's been some questions about what finance's role is relative to the CIO, but we really work hard to make sure that sound investment decisions about IT projects are made, and that OCIO's recommendations are heard, and they have a voice at the table when budget decisions are being made with respect to IT investments.
Relating back to the question I asked on the general fund expenditures for IT, are you, is finance doing a different kind of review of projects that are either underway or just getting started based on our general fund problems?
I think it's fair to say that any general fund project gets extra scrutiny in this day. Obviously, we look at projects that are an ongoing investment where we've spent a significant amount of money over time, perhaps a little differently than a brand new proposal that we could delay. And to the point of special fund versus general fund, in this environment, as you know, many of the special funds are in difficult straits themselves. And so we don't necessarily view special funded proposals any different than general fund proposals. The bar is not necessarily any lower in these tight financial times.
So we would expect then to see reductions or limitations in some of these IT projects for this next fiscal year, based on that assertion.
Well, as you know, the governor's budget's under development at this moment, and I can't really speak to what will or won't be in the governor's budget until it's released.
Juan, do you have anything? Yeah. Assemblymember Arambula.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Help us understand what the relationship is within, if we had an organizational chart, for example, would the office of, the OCIO, what box would they be under? Who do they report to? And what's DOF's relationship organizationally? Are you guys co-equals? Are you on a reporting basis? How does that work? Is it more collegial, or is it, a line of authority?
I would say it's more. We are both control agencies with respect to roles, so we're more co-equals, especially with respect to IT funding and IT decisions.
Okay.
There's no line of reporting between finance and the OCIO, or vice versa.
Okay. So there's some independence in terms of being able to argue for your respective points of view.
Yes.
Okay. In the material that we have in our binder, there's a report from the Pew Center. You're familiar with that? I did well in college and grad school. I was in the top half of the class. It seems like California is in the half of the class that's making the top half possible. By that I mean our score is in the bottom half of the class, and yet, for California, that's kind of a major disappointment. Do you agree with the grades, the the performance grades in the Pew report? And if so, what can we do to go from a C plus to a B plus or better?
Assembly member, I believe that report was begun prior to the establishment of our office, and we've done significant things vis-a-vis the recommendations that they've done. As you may be aware, the state CIO, Terry Takai, came to California from the state of Michigan, and if you'll look at that report, Michigan was ranked in the top tier. So improving on that rating, while, you know, not the be-all, end-all of our activities, we believe that it is a credible organization. Pew is a credible organization that puts forth these reports in an effort to improve government and governance, and we've taken several steps to increase California's grade in that measure.
So we should look forward to the next report card, in other words.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's hope it doesn't get lost like sometimes mine did coming home.
I want to, well, it gets published, so it can't get lost. I want to ask a couple of questions related to that scorecard, because I read through the 2-column narrative that's here, the story that accompanies the scorecard, and it has nothing to do with our IT systems. It's all about our budget and other issues. So that was completely useless in terms of being able to figure out what's going on. But over on the right-hand column, they have different categories, and then they have whether something is a strength, whether it's mid-level or a weakness. I want to focus on the weaknesses. In the top section, there's money, structural balance, and we get dinged for that. Well, that's not your fault. That's all of our faults. So that one I just dismissed out of hand. And they gave us a D plus for that, by the way, Juan. So that we all share in that one.
Sometimes they're generous.
We all share. We all share in that. Under people,
that one may not be getting better.
yeah. Under people, hiring is one of the categories that they have, and maybe it's related to what we were just describing about the personnel and our cost competitiveness or pay competitiveness. The last one, though, in the people section was managing employee performance, and that's something that I think is very fixable on the part of the OCIO. Infrastructure, maintenance is a negative, and internal coordination is a negative. I assume having you taking over, this is from 2008, so I assume that having the OCIO have the new controls, that'll improve.
Actually, this section of the report that you're referring to is more broad than IT infrastructure. It's referring to broad infrastructure planning, like land use planning, transportation planning, that kind of planning. And it's really referencing the linkage between intergovernmental work. If you look at the report, it talks about, for example, the Strategic Growth Council, the CTC, and then the efforts that they actually have underway right now with respect to CSAC and the League and various other county organizations, of government.
So internal, they mean within the state, not within state government.
Right.
Okay. Again, that's hit or miss depending on which county you're dealing with. The maintenance is something that's very much under our control. And then finally, under information, they have a red mark for budgeting for performance. And I think that's a weakness in all of state government. In fact, in January, I think we're going to be doing a hearing on performance measurement across the board. So it's the grade is a C, but when you look at some of the components that are being negatively impacted, I didn't see that it was specific to our IT or our information management. It just didn't. One thing didn't correspond with the other for me. I guess when you're doing something nationally, you have to come up with these broad categories. But I think these areas that I mentioned that are the hiring issues and managing employee performance, maintenance, and to the extent we have some control on internal coordination, those are the areas that I took away as areas of need. The other two I just, again, dismissed because that's a bigger problem than you all can handle. Thank you very much. Our last panelist is from the Franchise Tax Board with a good story to tell.
Good morning. My name is Susan Cadu. I'm currently the procurement officer at FTB, but prior to that, I served 3 years on the Child Support Automation System Center as the deputy project director in charge of project administration and network services. And just to build on what Adrian said, I guess I should say that I'm a certified project manager, but I need to confess I was an anthropology major a long, long time ago. The Child Support Automation System project was indeed a successful project, but it challenges some of the widely held tests for successful projects. It was expensive and it was long. The final price tag for CSAS was approximately $1.6 billion. Much of the expense came from two major procurements, one for the statewide disbursement unit, which was approximately $200 million. The other one was for the child support enforcement system, which was approximately $848 million. But let me quickly add that there are several factors that offset these costs. Besides being two-thirds federally funded, the successful completion of the project relieved the state of the hefty federal penalties that were alluded to earlier, which were imposed as a result of our failure to have a statewide system by October 1st, 1997. From 1998 through 2005, which was the last year that we paid the full amount of the penalty, California paid almost $1 billion in penalties. 100% of that payment came from the state's general fund. Just as important, though, the project allowed the state to really deliver important child support services. Before CSAS came into existence, a non-custodial parent could simply move to another county to avoid paying child support. There were also large deliverables that came as a result of this project. A centralized payment processing center for child support, the case management system, and the enforcement system, and a call system. Call center, rather. And finally, the contract provided 2 full years of maintenance and operation for the new system, valued at approximately $100 million per year. I mentioned that it was long. It took 9 years from the point that the legislation was passed to the point that the last county, which was Los Angeles, rolled onto the new system. Again, let me quickly add that there are factors that you really need to consider before you judge it too long. Back in 1998, there was no statewide program. All 58 counties deliver child support services in their own rather unique way. The system had to be very complex. It interacts with over 21 state and federal systems. And as I previously stated, it required 2 major procurements for the state disbursement unit and also for the enforcement system. So I know it's really hard to understand how any project could take 9 years. I developed a really high-level timeline that I think has just been passed out to you, which kind of just shows some of the very high-level kind of activities that go into a project this size. I'll be glad to speak to that later if you have any questions, but my real point is that maybe long and expensive aren't always the best tests to judge a successful project. Through our large IT projects at FTB, we've developed a set of lessons learned that we think may be better predictors of a project's success. The first one, and maybe the most important, is constructing a compensation model so that the vendor and the state have common objectives. We've learned that when the state and vendor work as a team towards those objectives, the odds of project success dramatically increase. On CSAS, we paid the vendor not for a specific piece of hardware or software, but for the things that were ultimately important to the state. For example, we paid them when counties successfully rolled onto the system, or when the penalties were put in abeyance, or when the system was finally federally certified. Our second lesson is around performance review. We learned vendors must be reviewed for management performance, and these reviews should have financial consequences for poor performance. By simply withholding a small amount of compensation until issues are appropriately addressed, we can get the vendor's attention and motivation. On CSAS, we measured things such as the contractor's willingness to partner for success, the degree to which they were meeting the schedule, and the degree to which they met our quality standards. So here's kind of an example how it worked. The contractor was required or was responsible to deliver training. The initial feedback from the participants was very unfavorable. In a more traditional kind of setting, frankly, there was probably little we could have done about it. But through our performance review process, we strongly expressed our displeasure, and the contractor went back and significantly revamped the training to meet both the state and the county's expectations. The third lesson has to do with management requirements. We learned rigor or quality in the system development process must be built in. This is accomplished with requirements that are based on industry standards and best practices. In the past, we placed too much emphasis on what the system must do and too little on what the contractor must do to build a quality system. A good set of technical management requirements will give you the tools and the control gates needed. Without these checkpoints, verification is left to the final days before implementation. So simply stated, technical management requirements help you avoid problems before they happen. The fourth is having a robust project management methodology. I think you heard some of that already today. Projects must be staffed with respected and trusted project managers, and they must be encouraged to be forthcoming and should not be discouraged from raising issues or delivering bad news. A good project manager should know the techniques to be able to control scope, quality, schedule, how to mitigate risks, and perhaps the most important is to make sure that they're able to keep open lines of communication among all stakeholders using tools that are simple, accurate, and consistent. On CSAS, we used green, yellow, and red statuses on each of our main success indicators so that anyone looking at our status report could immediately tell if there were any areas of concerns. The fifth we call knowledge management, and this may kind of address somewhat the question of how do you get state staff trained in technology, and this is an example of even when you contract that this may be a way to get some of the training required for state staff. So projects must be adequately staffed with state staff to develop the expertise necessary to maintain and operate the new system. Although this obviously adds project costs in the short term, it reduces risks and costs in the long run. Most importantly, it facilitates hands-on involvement with state staff so that state can make informed decisions without about project problems instead of simply relying on the vendor. The sixth is about business involvement. Business staff, especially at the executive level, must be involved in IT projects. Projects are for business and must be business planned and business driven. Business staff should be involved in defining requirements, in testing, in developing training, in organizational change management, performance measure, and contract management. We've also learned that large projects must be given department-wide priority and focus. When FTB took responsibility for CSAS, all major IT work stopped. All other major IT projects stopped. It would be a sad day if we stopped working on IT. And finally, we've learned that overseers must be involved and supportive at the executive level. All large IT projects have problems concerning scope, schedule, and cost. Solutions to these problems often require the support of control agencies. On CSAS, we met regularly with our overseers, including our agency, finance, and OCIO, to check on project status, to understand project challenges, and to provide opportunity to head off project issues and risks. Thank you.
Thank you. The vendor pay or incentive mechanism that you used, had that been used anywhere else before, to your knowledge?
We actually used it on all of our major, at FTB, on all of our major systems. So for collections, our non-filer program, and our accounting system, we used very similar kind of measures. At FTB, since our product is revenue, that it makes it a little more easy to sell because we can actually generate revenue by those projects. But it was basically the same compensation model.
And do we use that model in these other projects?
It's really most effective in the benefit-based procurements where there's a revenue stream developed, and that otherwise it's very difficult to baseline what the added value of the technology system is. So within a revenue environment, we certainly use this methodology, and we are looking at ways to engage our vendor partners more effectively around these kinds of issues.
And you said that how much, what was the total bill for the fines that we ended up paying?
It was almost $1 billion. I think it was $972 million in 2005. We did make a payment in 2006, but 90% of that was reimbursed to the state.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah. I was on Budget Sub 1 for my first, well, I've been on Budget Sub 1 all along, but I remember this issue of throwing good money after bad. Do you have anything? Assemblymember Arambula?
In that particular instance with the child support, were there not county employees that were loaned to the state to help develop the program and to make sure that it was workable and from a practitioner's point of view?
Absolutely. And I think I was trying to address that in my idea that the business really has to be involved in any IT project. The counties were very involved. They help with requirements. They help with testing. They help with reviewing deliverables to make sure that they really met what the state and the counties needed.
And would the same hold true for, let's take another IT project where maybe county governments were not involved and it's all within the state administration, between agencies or departments. How can we systematically make sure that the users are involved in developing and monitoring and implementing what's developed?
Well, I'll use a case example, one of which is Fiscal. And so for that project, it's a system that finance, accounting, procurement, and budgeting staff in departments will be using. And we've been including those business stakeholders in the process. The governance of the project are the four major control agencies: finance, treasurer, controller, and general services. And then the OCIO is a member of that steering committee, and serving primarily as a project advisor, if you will, to make sure that the business is in alignment with the technology and in best practice for projects. If you look at almost any other project that's done on a departmental basis, it's being implemented for a programmatic purpose. So Caltrans, for example, frequently engages transportation engineers. Air Resources Board includes toxicologists and air scientists in their projects. So the state really has a culture of including the business stakeholders in projects to drive both requirements as well as outcomes.
Okay. And to the extent that there are successful experiences, like has just been described, how do we memorialize them? How do we make sure we remember them? I mean, the chair and I will not be here in 12 or 13 months, and so I think you've served on a budget committee, will have served for 6 years, and as have I. And so that institutional memory will no longer be here. How do we make sure that good things that were done are memorialized so that as new folks come in, either staff or members of the legislature, how do we keep that institutional memory of what went wrong and what went right so we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel?
Well, I think it's really documenting what lessons we've learned and how we've learned them. I mean, there's obviously no substitution for experience, but if we continue to make the same mistakes, then shame on us. So one of the things that we've done proactively.
But if the legislature changes, it won't know.
Yeah, but I think most public employees have personal pride, and they don't want to do the job the wrong way, especially if they can do it the right way. And so I think by working closely with different employee groups and different agencies, we can ensure that they get the training and knowledge transfer that they need, both from other state employees as well as from vendors, and then we can document the efforts that we've made. They're recognized. Our progress has been recognized by national organizations, from Brookings Institution to the Center for Digital Government to various others. But we also, just between 2003 and now, the state has implemented over 150 IT projects successfully. These do things from child support to the collection of more than $790 million in revenue by franchise tax. Lots of things around Medicare Part D that had to be implemented quickly so that seniors and other low-income people could get access to prescription drug benefits. So IT does continue to serve a public purpose and make government more efficient. However, as long as the news media continues to focus on failure, a lot of the failures are from the 1990s or earlier.
Well, and I'm not alluding to the news media necessarily, but and I don't dispute that there have been a number of success stories. I guess where I'm going, though, is what kind of ongoing reporting relationship should there be between your efforts, finance's efforts, and the legislature's responsibility to have some oversight and budget responsibilities? How can the legislature as an institution, through either this committee and or the various budget committees, have an ongoing knowledge or a continuous reporting relationship so that we know as an institution what's going on, what has worked and what hasn't?
I mean, I think that the legislation that established the OCIO and subsequent statutory changes have really put in place a strong performance framework, both around the requirement that on every January 15th, the OCIO present a strategic plan to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. In addition, we're required, as a result of the reorganization plan, to submit a performance report. If we make any changes to that performance report, we're required by statute to inform the legislature why those changes were made. And if we're going to convince legislators to continue to invest limited resources in IT, it's in our personal interest and professional interest to invest the time and effort necessary to ensure that they understand where we were, where we are, and where we're going.
I agree with you. From a practical point of view, though, through the budget process, if there is no BCP, if there is no budget change proposal, no need to change, from a prior year, we don't see that unless we specifically ask for it. And new folks may not know to ask for it. So how do we make sure that that there is a comprehensive or systematic way of keeping the legislature informed about what's going on with IT projects in general? It's an open-ended question. It doesn't demand an answer today, but it's an invitation to think about how we can have that kind of ongoing relationship. Because you're right, to the extent the legislature knows and understands and buys in to what it is that you're doing, we'll be in a better position to provide the necessary support and the understanding when hiccups come up, as they invariably will. But if we, if you think you're doing a great job and we in the legislature don't know, and we hear about a blip here or there, then it may cause some difficulties between us, or it may result in us overlooking the good things or not providing the necessary resources that you feel that you need to carry on your responsibilities. So it's more an open-ended invitation. And I know, Mr. Chairman, you had some suggestions about how to keep some kind of a record. And I think that's kind of in the direction where I was going. So I'm very open. I see value in having that kind of exchange of information on a regular, systematic basis.
Well, that's a good segue to talk about the recommendations, and we'll open it up to public comment. There are 4 staff recommendations here, committee recommendations. Develop a template of questions that should be raised as information technology projects are brought before the legislature for policy or financial approval. And there is a draft here that I think you've been given, and this is just a draft for the discussion of what should be in this template. We would submit this template to the legislative analyst, budget committee, and subcommittee staff to be vetted, and it would be the source for our ongoing evaluation of any of these projects. The next recommendation is that the LAO or budget staff maintain project books for the duration of project development from start to finish, so that new legislators or staff attempting to understand and assess project approval and or funding requests can obtain data to inform them quickly about the past efforts and reasons for various project action. That's, I think, getting to the term limit issue and turnover issue. That's more something for us than for you. Recommend that upon completion of the testing and implementation of state IT projects, the project books be archived so future projects can draw on what is learned. Again, that's more for us to improve the way we function. But the fundamental thing is to have the information in these sources that we can readily assess something, particularly during the budget times. But throughout the year, there are always policy issues that arise that have IT implications. So those are the recommendations for today. With that, I'd open it to the general public. Anybody wishing to speak on today's topic? All right. We don't have a quorum, obviously, so the recommendations will be carried over to a subsequent hearing. In the meantime, you have the questions. I would ask that we work together with budget staff and the LAO and CIO to flesh this out and have it ready to go.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
if I may, even though we don't have a quorum, I'd like to weigh in and say that I'm very supportive of the recommendations, and at the appropriate time, we'll be glad to move that they be approved by the full committee. And certainly the direction that this committee is going has been very helpful for the work that the subcommittee, on the budget subcommittee, will take in terms of reviewing projects that come within our committee's jurisdiction. I know that sometimes the projects fall into different subcommittees, but it would also be helpful for us to follow up with the other subcommittee chairs to make sure that we're all on board in terms of our approach. And then finally, I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a very constructive discussion on what could be an issue that other folks might find it easy to demagogue. I think it's very complicated. I think it's something that is very useful for us to get a handle on, and the manner in which and the questions and the issues, I think, have been laid out in a very constructive way. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I think, as I think I said in my opening comments, we need to have the information with which to make decisions, and then we have to have the guts to make the decision if the information leads you down, a certain path. And I don't feel that at this point we have enough information. It's been very helpful to have the CIO's office, not just today. We've had a couple of, as I mentioned, a couple of other hearings where IT projects have come into question. And so it's been very helpful to have that interaction. Going forward, we need to have more of a basis for making our decisions when it comes to funding things, especially because of our really tough times. Did any of you have any closing comments?
I just say I really appreciate the venue that you provide for our office to come in and discuss these issues, because as Assemblymember Rembula indicated, it's not always in the appropriate time frame or the appropriate setting. So we appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. All we're doing is trying to highlight things and try to better inform the legislature, the budget process, et cetera, so we could do our jobs better. Occasionally some of the folks that come before us don't come with the right openness, and that's when things get testy, but we haven't had that experience with you.
Well, we'll continue to have all our information on the internet for you.
Thank you all very much. This meeting is adjourned.